Mr. President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier today, the minority leader came down to the Senate floor and unfortunately, once again, mischaracterized both the objectives and the motives of Senate Republicans in the pursuit of the changes we wanted to make with respect to the CARES Act emergency lending program. And I want to address that. But let me just say candidly, I understand his frustration. The Republicans together set out 4 goals for the country with respect to these programs, and we achieved all 4 goals. So I guess that's a little bit frustrating. Let me go through just a little bit of recent history on this. Let's remember, this debate has been going on for several months. And the Democrats' original position was to keep these programs in place. In fact, many of them wanted to expand them. They certainly wanted to extend them well past the end of the year. How do we know that? Well, among other ways, Senator Schumer himself sent a letter to Secretary Mnuchin and Chairman Powell asking exactly that they extend these programs. But you might wonder, why would they want to extend an emergency lending facility when we're clearly not in an emergency in terms of the financial markets? And the reason is that a lot of Democrats had other purposes in mind for these programs. And in my view, those other purposes would have constituted a terrible misuse of those programs. Now, one of the goals, clearly, was to kind of morph the Fed's municipal liquidity facility into a bailout fund for states and municipalities. Now, how do we know that? Well, because the Democratic-controlled House passed a bill that would require that. There's no mystery here. They passed a bill that specifically would require the Fed to use the municipal liquidity facility to bail out states and municipalities under outrageous terms, ultra-low interest rates, ultra-long-term loans, 25 basis point interest rate, 10 years. States wouldn't even need to attest, as they do under current law, that they were unable to secure credit elsewhere. Basically, they wanted to turn the Fed from the lender of last resort to the lender of first resort. So they were clear about that. There are many Democratic activists and folks here who are sympathetic with them that have other purposes as well, such as using the corporate credit facility as a way to coerce the behavior they want from corporations. Now, it wasn't about extending credit to companies that need credit. It's about achieving a social or cultural or political objective by attaching terms to the loans that would result in that. Those are the kinds of uses that many on their side had. And how do we know that? Well, among other things, they beat us up almost every day for not voting on the HEROES Act. I think they intended to vote for it. And so they would have been voting for this very misuse. So our goal was simple. Our goal as a conference, or a consensus of Republican senators, was to end these programs consistent with the intent of the law, and in fact, I believe the letter of the law, prevent the misuse, and make sure that the Fed's legitimate functions are not impinged upon. So how are we going to do this? We're going to do this with 4 steps, 4 specific goals that would allow us to achieve that outcome for the American people. Number 1, sweep the unused money out of those accounts and repurpose it. Use it for other better purposes. We have other needs. And that's an important objective. It also makes sure that the money is not available for misuse if we are shifting it out of these facilities and putting it to good use. Now, again, initially, the Democrat position was in opposition to this, but to their credit, the bipartisan group of 8 folks who got together and were the catalyst for the bill that we're working on now, the Republicans persuaded the Democrats to accept this idea, that the money should be swept out, and to the credit of the Democrats there, they agreed. And so that became the basis, or one of the bases, of this piece of legislation that we've been working on, and it achieves Republicans' first goal. The second goal is to end the programs as the statute intended. And as I say, I believe the statute achieves that, but there is a very aggressive interpretation to the contrary. So we know that Senator Schumer wanted to extend these programs well beyond the end of the year. We know it from his letter that he wrote. But to his credit, he ultimately relented, and Republicans achieved our second goal. The third goal that we had was to make sure that these programs aren't simply resuscitated next year. We all know there's going to be a new Secretary of the Treasury, and a joint decision by the Treasury Secretary and the Fed are what govern this program. Now, I don't think they would have the legal authority to resume this, but many of our Democratic colleagues openly advocated that despite the fact that Secretary Mnuchin and Powell had agreed not to extend these programs, that a new Treasury Secretary should in fact resume these programs, start them up again. We said no. And again, to the credit of our Democratic colleagues, they relented, and Republicans achieved our third goal. The fourth was simply to forbid the creation of a clone that would circumvent the third, right? If you had to end a particular lending facility, but you could just create an identical version of it or a nearly identical version of it and call it something else, well, that would defeat the purpose of ending the one you ended. So we needed in statute to make it clear that there would be a prohibition against the creation of a clone or a near clone. This one, Senator Schumer fought us hard on. I will say he fought us hard on this. And in the course of exchanges, we kept getting documents that didn't have any reference to this at all. But in the end, he agreed that we would have this prohibition. We then went back and forth on the exact language, exactly what would constitute a clone, as I'm using the term, and what wouldn't. We got to an agreement, and we achieved our fourth goal. So I want to commend my Democratic colleagues for working with us to get here. It wasn't easy, and I know there's a lot in this that they don't love about this. But with respect to these really important goals for the American people, we're making progress. One of the other things that I just have to address, because the leader brought this up in his comments earlier, was a terrible misrepresentation of what our objective was. Why did we think it was so important to end these programs in the first place? Our intent was not, as Senator Schumer implied on the floor today, to sabotage the incoming administration's ability to stabilize the economy. And that's a direct quote. That was not our intent. So what was our intent? Well, first, I mentioned earlier, we think it's important that you follow the law, and we believe the law requires that these be shut down. We understand that there was going to be an aggressive attempt to circumvent that by interpreting the law differently, and so we felt clarify the statute, make it unambiguous, and we would achieve that. The second thing is, of course, it's completely consistent with congressional intent. Let me say, I was one of the two Republican senators in the room when we were negotiating this part of the CARES Act with our Democratic counterparts, Secretary Mnuchin, our respective staffs, and attorneys. There was nobody in the room who thought for a minute that these were meant to be indefinite programs. Remember where we were. We were absolutely convinced, and I think rightly, that we were on the verge of a full-blown financial crisis, a meltdown in the financial markets. And if that had happened, it's very likely we would have had a full-blown depression that could have lasted a very, very long time. Credit markets were freezing. Companies couldn't borrow. Do you know what that means when that happens to a business? They can't make payroll. Because if they can't access credit, if they can't borrow, draw down on a bank facility, or issue their commercial paper, or issue their corporate bond, if they can't raise the credit they need, they can't pay their bills. And when the credit markets freeze up and businesses can't pay their bills, including payroll, you have a full-blown, unmitigated disaster. That's what we wanted to prevent. The purpose of these facilities was narrow. It was to restore the normal functioning of the private lending and capital markets of America. The purpose was never to replace those markets. The purpose was never to pick winners and losers and decide which companies and industries should get favorable terms and which should not. It was none of those things. And it was very much not intended to be some kind of all-purpose cure-all for whatever economic ills there are. None of that. The purpose was always to ensure that credit-worthy borrowers could access credit through normal channels. Well, guess what, Mr. President? It worked. It worked better than we could have imagined, better than I was even hoping, because within days, credit markets were flowing again, because lenders had the confidence that through these facilities, the markets would not collapse. There would not be a freezing up. They would be able to function, and therefore they had the confidence to make that loan to that company that needed to make its payroll and all the other innumerable transactions that have to take place. In fact, it worked so well that as of now, I think, total credit has flown at an all-time record pace in the United States of America. Corporate bond issuance is off the charts. Very high credit, lower credit, debt and equity. The capital markets have been flowing. Credit lines from banks have been flowing. The programs achieved their limited purpose extremely well. Now, look, are there other economic needs in America? Absolutely. I mean, there are industries that have been devastated, the restaurant industry, hotels, transportation. We know that. And we've got legislation that is attempting to address many of those issues with forgivable loans and an increase in unemployment benefits and other provisions. It's here on the Senate floor through legislation like that that we should decide how, whether, and to what extent we're going to address those problems. That's our job, to do it through an appropriation process here in the Senate. That is not the job of the Fed. And that brings me to another really important reason why we didn't want these programs to continue indefinitely. And that is to protect the Fed from being politicized, to preserve the independence of the Fed, which is very, very important. If the Fed ever became simply an extension of one of the political parties, we'd be in a very, very bad place. But think about it. If these programs were going to continue indefinitely, and our Democratic colleagues got their wish that is represented in the HEROES Act, to have massive subsidies for municipalities, think about the amount of political pressure on the Fed to bail out whoever is the preferred constituent of the day. Private or public, municipal or business. Just think about how it would be used. And think about the strings that they would, they've advocated this. Many of our Democratic colleagues have said this could be a way to encourage unionization or encourage the composition of the board to look like we'd like it to look. It's an endless list. And it is all wildly inappropriate for the Central Bank of America to be engaged in this kind of thing. You should never put the Fed in a position of the incredible political pressure they would have been under. So, Mr. President, with this bill, and I hope we're able to vote on this, if not today, then tomorrow, there are some things in this bill, unrelated things that I like. I do think we need another round of PPP loans. I do think we need the expanded eligibility for unemployment benefits, for instance. There's things I don't like. I think direct payments to people who have not suffered a loss of income makes no sense whatsoever. But this topic I've been discussing, the end of these 13(3) lending facilities, are very important parts of the bill that I like very much. There are 4 important objectives we set out, and we achieved them. Sweeping the money out, shutting down existing facilities, the 4 existing CARES-funded facilities, forbidding their reopening without the consent of Congress, and forbidding clones from being an end run around that, all without impinging on the Fed's ability to intervene in the markets in emergency circumstances. Those were our objectives. In this legislation, we achieve all 4 of those objectives. I would say that's a good day's work, and I yield the floor.